Hi, everyone. We're starting our webinar, our last live session with Professor Viana and Professor May. Just to make sure, Professor Viana may appear to you as
We're starting our webinar,
Caio, but it's just another computer he's using. So I'll let Professor Viana and Peter start the webinar.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Peter. It's great to have you all in this meeting. We have two questions that have arrived before the webinar. So we will address these two questions, and then we will open for other questions that can be sent in the meantime. So I believe Mariana has posted these questions in the chat. Right, Mariana? You have those questions in the chat, right? So the first one is a question from Armando Kokitsu. And it's a rather long question, but basically what he says is that the current political situation in the Brazilian Congress is very much against the environmental agenda and what should be done in both in Brazil and in other countries that have similar situations. And I'll provide a first answer, and then I'll let Peter make his comments afterwards, and then we go into the other question. Well, indeed, Armando, the political situation at the federal level in Brazil is very much against the environmental and indigenous peoples agenda. And we should also, unfortunately, notice that this is also the case in several other countries, including, for example, Peru. I have just come from an event in Puerto Maldonado in Peru, following the visit of Pope Francis, where we had a seminar with indigenous peoples. And the situation of the Congress of Peru is also very much in line with the same concerns that you pose in your question. In other words, there is a lot of vested interest in expanding the road network in the Amazonian part of Peru, and in promoting activities that end up in deforestation, such as illegal timber and mining. So, with these two cases, I would say that usually there is a big influence in the congresses of various countries of those industries that benefit from deforestation. So this can be agriculture, cattle, logging, mining, and so on. So this, unfortunately, is a sort of a widespread challenge. In the particular case of Brazil, it needs to be remembered that Brazil is a federation. So with roles of states and municipalities in both policy design and policy implementation. Actually, a significant part of the deforestation observed in the first decade of this century was associated with subnational policies at the state level and at the municipal level. Oftentimes, the fact that the deforestation rates are announced by the federal government gives the impression that the federal government is responsible for those outcomes that the satellites pick up. But in fact, this is a result of not only state and municipal governments, but also of civil society organizations that played an important role in reducing deforestation. And here I'll just single out the soy moratorium, which was coordinated by institutions like Greenpeace and had a huge impact on deforestation, and other civil society organizations that have had important influence. So what's the strategy? What to do? My approach to this is it's a political issue that needs to result in increasing the political support for this environmental and social agenda within the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. And there is a need to share more information. The society in general is not fully aware of the issues and not very well informed. So I think we have a huge communication challenge, which should build on not only conventional media, but also on social media and different strategies of communicating the issue. And which are the issues? To me, and this is an area where we at FAS, Amazonas Sustainable Foundation, we're going to focus more our attention in the next coming years. It's the nexus between health and deforestation. Health or deforestation results in forest fires results in pollution, and air pollution is very much associated with health issues. So this nexus, I think, can have a huge impact on how societies, especially in the Amazon, perceive deforestation. And I think there's an interesting parallel with what happened in China. Air pollution in China became a huge public health issue, and as a result of that, the government decided to implement very ambitious green policies to reduce air pollution, mostly driven by health concerns. So with those comments, I'll pass it over to Peter and see what you have to say about these issues.
Yeah, well, are you hearing me? It's
yes.
great to be back on board with the getting back to Earth here. And I really want to express my agreement basically with what Virgilio has said about the both the problems. The problems are maybe something that we can address from a scientific perspective with a fair degree of certainty of what the outcomes might be, from a purely technical the relationship between excessive use of pesticides, for example, and soil quality and human health are fairly well presented in the literature, and science and medicine have been very successful in presenting these cases. But when there are significant political and economic interests in seeing the continued use of seriously polluting chemicals of this type that Armando has been talking about, and also Madalena in their questions. These are issues which then confront blockage by the political and governmental bureaucracies that have a vested interest in seeing that the status quo is retained, and that people, the large-scale agribusiness and the dealers in the fundamental molecular basis for pesticides, for example, they're all multinationals. These are not being produced in Brazil. They are being bought in Brazil. Brazil is the largest per capita and per hectare applier of agrochemicals in the world these days. So somebody has sold the agribusiness community on the effectiveness of these chemicals in securing a greater productivity per unit area, per unit labor, etc., so that there is a demand. So looking at this in a purely economic perspective, then we can sort of consider that what we need is better information and better awareness on the part of the interests that are involved of the effectiveness of spending so much money on these agrochemicals in actually achieving achieving better output, in showing that the products that are being obtained from these systems are in fact of validity for society in terms of their health connotations. As Virgilio said, this health is going to be able to unite the interests of the rural and urban population in a form that will enable a greater political force in opposition to excessive use of pesticides and excessive deforestation for agricultural expansion to be combated. So we're going to have to see this uniting of interests between groups in the rural area and the urban areas to bring these ideas home, both in the national context and in the international pressures that can be brought. We're seeing this week, for example, what's going on in Davos in the World Economic Forum is, everybody's saying, well, these problems are global in nature and we have to address them at the global level. And then we have somebody like Mr. Trump coming back and saying, well, no, I'm not worried about the globe. I'm just worried about me and my golf course. And so, this is the kind of context we're facing, in which we have to find new ways of using the media, using social media, as Virgilio mentioned, as being tools for alerting society and bringing about this urban and rural unification of interests to pressure society for change.
Excellent, Peter. It just occurred to me to make a point about an important actor in this field, which is the opposite of Donald Trump, and this is Pope Francis. Pope Francis is certainly the most important leader for humanity. That's not only for Catholics, on the Sustainable Development Agenda. And it was very interesting to see him in Peru. And I had the chance of going to Puerto Maldonado, where he started his visit last week in Peru. And he made a number of very symbolic moves. One was to begin the visit in the Amazon region of Peru, making a speech about the Amazon. The second was addressing, first of all, the indigenous peoples of the Amazon. So the section that was his inauguration speech, so to speak, or his first speech, was for indigenous people. And he made a very strong case that development should not be done at the expense of the rights of indigenous peoples, especially those who are in voluntary isolation. And I think the encyclica Laudato Si is a very powerful tool. So, Armando, another strategy to face this challenge, which, as I said before, and Peter highlighted, is not only in Brazil, but in most countries, like United States, like Peru, and I mean, we could probably list a very large number of countries in which the economic interests are against sustainable development, and we have to find allies and strategies. And Pope Francis, I think, it's a very, very important ally. Peter touched on the question number 2, and I'd like also to make some comments. This is a question from Madalene Amoaco, and she's speaking about Africa, and and she asked, what are the effects of agrochemicals on soil, especially in Africa? And she said that she read something about those chemicals and that they destroy all the nutrients in the soil. To what extent is this true? Actually, it's not precisely the destruction of the nutrients. The chemicals, the biggest impact that agrochemicals have on soil is the destruction of the biota, of the living organisms of the soil. not the nutrients, because the nutrients are minerals, and they're not as impacted by chemicals as these small microorganisms that are the makeup of the most important part of soil fertility, which is the organic matter. It's important to notice that there is something called CTC, is a capacity of exchange of cations, CEC in English, CTC in Portuguese, capacidade de troca de nutrientes. And so organic matter is the key element in terms of soil management in the tropics, especially. So too much use of agrochemicals is very detrimental to the organic component of the soils. So what should be done? And she talks about the tipping point. Well, I think in general we have too much use, and the strategy should be to reduce the use. First, doing the minimum would be to limit the use to the allowed dosage, which is sometimes quite high, but it's still, there's a limit. And oftentimes people use much more than the allowable dosage of chemicals. And this is oftentimes stimulated by stores that sell those products that just want to push for more sales of these chemicals. And the second approach I would suggest is to increase the use of organic soil management. And that means using composts, using green fodder as biomass to cover soil and to increase the organic matter in the soil. And this is probably the way to increase plant health. And by increasing plant health, you increase the resistance of plants against pests and diseases. So we need to have a more holistic approach to plant health, and that includes increasing plant soil health or soil health as a strategy to reduce the demand on chemicals. And another approach is to increase the market for organic products. And this is happening in many countries already, including developing countries. There is a growing market for this. And I think the more the market grows, the more we will have economic incentives to go more towards organic types of agricultural production. And
Uh-oh, I lost you. We lost Virgilio. Can you hear me at least? I can maybe talk a little bit about soil fertility and fertilizers and agrochemicals also.
Yeah, and I just posted another comment from someone who's watching us also on the video chat.
Yeah, I saw that. But I was thinking also, remembering one of the other areas that brings indigenous people their knowledge of the environment and the management of soils in the rural areas together. There's been it's maybe a shortcut to maintaining soil fertility and improving soil fertility that has been discussed a lot lately. That's the use of what's called biochar, which is a really charcoal that is found in the environment because of past burning. In fact, there's a lot of biomass that has been burned in the environment. Historically, the Indians used charcoal from their slash and burn activities and others, and as well as the presence of pits of waste, human waste and animal waste, the food waste, whatever was being stored in pits, and then they combining this with soil, they were able to increase their productivity and enhance the level of nutrition and improve increase the number of people who were able to be sustained. So in fact, there is some history more recently discussing the presence of indigenous populations in the Amazon that shows that there were millions. There may have been 10 million or more Indians living in the Amazon, and many more than there are today. So it's about 250,000 Indians living in the Amazon these days. So technology and knowledge obtained and provided by indigenous societies to their counterparts around the world through this Biochar Initiative is one way of overcoming some of the problems with soil fertility. I don't know if Virgilio was able to get back in here and talk about this question from Rashida Attar, who is thanking us for his for the course and talking about indigenous people and problems of deforestation in around Mumbai, where there has been proposing an expansion of a metro yard, where there'll be 3,000 trees cut, in which the tribes who are associated with this are staying there and trying to protect against the loss of that. So the indigenous people are being mobilized around the world to be the protectors of the forest, and they are really important actors and are increasingly recognized, recognized by the Pope and by cultural survival groups and by environmental groups and by governments as being those people who can be the stewards and the protectors of remaining forests. We have to rely on their knowledge and their understanding of what it means to take down the forests and remove these last vestiges of protection against catastrophes that are increasing globally because of global warming and all the other effects that are happening. There's another question here from Martin Ross about nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change as a means of dealing with some of these questions. And what is the potential of nature-based solutions? I think this is a very wide range, and I think biochar, for example, would be considered a nature-based solution because it's biomass coming from nature that is being used as a source of biochar. But there's a number of other possibilities, especially with the restoration of ecosystems and the protection of soils through the use of grass strips and terracing and other things that have been used for millennia all over the world, but have been abandoned by the agribusiness community of late because it's much easier to produce things if you plow everything down and make it all flat, and that is not necessarily the best solution in terms of nature. So I think Virgilio is back, so I will hand the table back to Virgilio to talk about it.
Okay, great, Peter. Yeah, I was cut off for a couple of minutes, but I'm back. I have a question now from India, Rashida Attar, and says, thank you very much for this very interesting and integrated course. And talking about indigenous people, it becomes so difficult to implement this when governments do not care about destroying forests for development. An example in Mumbai, where a road in a metro yard is proposed to cut 3,000 trees, and the tribe Wadi is against, and for a long time, and so are the environmentalists. And yeah, well, I think Atar, the issue is the conflict between economic interest and the interest of those who are oftentimes uh, less powerful, uh, marginalized peoples, such as indigenous peoples, and those of the next generation. And this is a very interesting ethical debate that we have at present. And this is who is going to defend the rights of those who are young babies or not yet born. Those are not making pressure on governments. So there's a very interesting ethical debate which is taking place now, and I have had the chance of very interesting sessions at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, which has a group called Ethics and Action for Sustainable Development. And we're discussing some of these issues, because it's not only that we have to defend the rights of indigenous people, but also those that are not yet represented and can have their voice heard. My suggestion in terms of action is campaign. It's everything that has been won against economic interests is through campaigns and activism. So we need to be more active. We need demonstrations. We need to get more attention. And in the case of cutting trees that you mentioned, I don't know the specific case of Mumbai that you're referring to. I think the communication on these issues should try to link as much as possible this environmental destruction to people's health. And again, I think this is an approach that can be very powerful. Is to say we're not here only defending the trees and the animals and so on in these forests. We're defending the value of these trees in cleaning up the air, in bringing fresh air to the landscape, because it's very important to have trees to reduce air temperatures, especially in huge areas like in Mumbai. I think this is an issue which is relevant. So reduction of air pollution and reduction of temperature, and also providing spaces for leisure and recreation. These are all issues that we can link to people's health, as well as clean water, because trees protect streams, and the streams are important source of water to supply rivers and cities. So that's how I would approach these issues. We have, but this is very culturally specific and very site specific. So my suggestion to you and those that are fighting against the destruction of this particular area in India is to see what are the options that you have to link these forests to people's interest locally in the vicinity of this forest, but also more broadly in the region and in the country. Back to Peter and see if you have comments on this question from India, Peter.
Right. Well, I was actually approaching it a little bit differently. I think that I agree that with Virgilio, the main way that we're going to see movement in terms of the policies and politics of environmental management is through campaigning and activism. And we're actually discussing at the moment the engagement of people like Pope Francis, for example, is the great activist, and the people who are working with him to promote Laudato Si and the concerns for the relationship between equity, social inequities, and the environment are going to be more effective, because they are active in promoting those concerns to society and making dramatizing the kinds of conflicts that are taking place. The indigenous movement in the Chipko movement in India in the past was very effective in stopping the expansion of large dams, for example, by tree hugging, just going into the area and holding onto the trees and as if their life depended on it, which it does. In fact, your life depends on keeping the trees in the watersheds. So these movements, these social movements of indigenous peoples, have been very effective in dramatizing and bringing home to the world and showing the need for action on the part of society and politics. So I was talking also a little bit while you were off, Virgilio, about the Biochar Initiative as one way of bringing indigenous knowledge from what has been known for millennia in the Amazon and other parts of the world, the possibility of increasing productivity in small-scale agriculture using biological materials. And there's a question here from Martin Ross on nature-based solutions in general. I was suggesting that the biochar may be considered a nature-based solution, but I think it's much more broadly considered to be those solutions that aspire to mimic or to retain the processes of the environment as the basis for resolution of climate conflicts and other issues. And I think that's very, very important. Dominique Raymond was also asking about biomimicry being applied around the world, and I'm not really aware of that. I've read a bit about it, but maybe you have some more to talk about.
Okay, no, excellent. Talking about still the campaigning part of it. Let me just share with you what happened last year here in Brazil. And while the federal government tried to open up a big area for mining in the Amazon, there was a huge outcry in the Brazilian society. And this resulted in pressures on the government. And this involved NGOs, involved artists, and involved scientists. Civil society organizations in general, and there was a huge pressure. And even with the Congress, with the majority in favor of those kinds of developments, the president had to back off. So these things work, and especially now with the possibility of having broad internet campaigns, this can be a very useful tool. So I strongly recommend all of you to be activists and engage and work that with a broad coalition of organizations, not just one organization, but rather a coalition of many organizations, a network of organizations to fight for those key issues and challenges that we have ahead of us. Regarding the ecosystem-based adaptation, I suggest you to look to a very interesting publication that I happen to have the privilege of being a co-author of, and this is a publication of the Royal Society of UK, and this is something like 3 years old already. We launched it in the Peruvian COP. So yeah, it's 2 to 3 years old, and maybe Mariana can dig that reference. It's a climate-based adaptation, and this was led by Georgina Mace, MACE, but it was the Royal Society that organized this. And it has a very interesting review of the state of the art of literature worldwide on this topic. And basically the challenge there is that whenever we have an adaptation issue, and there are many aspects of adaptation, but oftentimes associated with the extreme weather events, oftentimes associated with water, like floods and droughts. And the most conventional approach is to use concrete, is to build a dam or to build a wall, to whatever. It's sort of civil engineering approach, which is the business as usual. And oftentimes, not only they don't work, but also they are, most of the times, more expensive. So using ecosystem-based adaptation approaches can be very beneficial and have a better cost benefit the ratio than the conventional civil engineering approach. And there are many cases, like, for example, in coastal areas, restoring mangroves is relatively inexpensive compared to concrete approaches of protecting coastlines. That's not to say that we should never use concrete, but the point is that we should use more reforestation, more restoration of ecosystems to increase resilience for extreme climate events. The question about mimicry is of the biomimicry is the use of similar approach to what we have in nature, which is to dissimulate against an enemy. And there are very interesting approaches to that, in using plants and animals that can be a tool for dealing with pests and diseases. And let me share with you a very interesting related practical solution that we happen to develop here at FAS in the Amazon. And this was associated with a guaraná production. Guaraná is a shrub that produces a fruit which has a seed which is very rich in terms of nutrients. It's an energetic drink domesticated by Indians, not this species. So people noticed that the occurrence of certain pests were much smaller whenever there was certain species of ants in the agricultural areas. So we did a partnership with the Institute of Homeopathy of São Paulo, and they worked on a product that is a homeopathic product that was then sprayed in the guaraná plants using parts of these spiders, and this was not was very diluted, or not spiders, I'm sorry, ants. It was very diluted, so it didn't destroy all the ants, just was a sort of a collection of some of the ants, and it had 84% efficiency in dealing with these particular pests. So that's not biomimicry in the stricto sensu, but it's an example of a non-conventional approach to pests and diseases. And my message here is to say that we should be more creative and use more of non-conventional approaches. And for those of you who are younger than Peter and myself, who have already some gray hair and gray beard, this is a great area to devote your career, to invest in innovation using products which are non-conventional. Back to you, Peter.
Yeah, well, for all my gray hairs, there's lots of things to learn, I assure you. And we continue, and even in this later stage of life, in trying to learn. And I've just come across this resilience to extreme weather report from the Royal Society. It looks excellent, and I will definitely be bringing it to my classroom this March when I get back to Brazil. But yeah, I think all and any alternatives that that promote the retention of natural ecosystems as much as possible in their natural state, but if necessary in adapted status. I'm sorry about my dog here. I think probably communicating to the world her dissatisfaction. But anyways, the retention of ecosystems to the extent possible in their natural state will be the most effective factor in promoting resilience of societies and nature to change, to global change and to local change, so that we have to find ways to protect what remains and to restore what has been degraded. Those are the most important aspects of our work these days. And I think that we should definitely promote those kinds of solutions as being. There's a lot of discussion about green infrastructure, for example, which is pretty much along the same lines. That the infrastructure provided by natural watersheds is a cheaper and more effective way to ensure water supply and stability against flood risk and landslides and things which have been very, very serious in Brazil and everywhere in the world. We see it as with the increasing number of extreme events climatically, there is going to be more and more need for finding solutions that promote the retention of ecosystem functioning. So that's we're in agreement on that.
Yeah, and Martin Ross sent a complimentary question. What are the disadvantages and what's missing for the ecosystem-based approach to fully take off and become more mainstream? Again, this report I mentioned, I think, can be very informative about some of these questions. But I'll just single out, Martin, that there is a need for those of us who know those climate ecosystem-based solutions to be more vocal, to participate more in decision-making process, which are usually dominated by civil engineers. So I think there's also a very important opportunity and very interesting opportunity for generating new scientific evidence of the efficacy and efficiency and equity, the 3 E's of the ecosystem-based adaptation approaches. One has to remember that, for example, to do what is being done in China now, which is largely an ecosystem-based adaptation, as China is going through a large-scale restoration of mountains and rivers. This is labor-intensive. So that means that a lot of poor people who can work on restoration, basically tree planting and digging soil and doing small dams and so on, can get a job from this. So I think it's very important to link ecosystem-based adaptations to jobs, and jobs are very attractive to policymakers. So that's how I would approach in terms of convincing policymakers that ecosystem-based adaptations are more efficient. First of all, by making the case that they usually generate more jobs, and jobs usually result in votes, so politicians tend to listen to that. And secondly, that they are more cost effective. And this needs to be documented. And I think there is a great opportunity for research on this, as I have mentioned before. So I think this is also something which is missing more. And this was also something that we found in this report, that we need more cases to document the cost and the benefits associated with ecosystem-based adaptation approaches. And finally, we have to make the case that these approaches should be considered as part of the
I think we may have lost lost Virgilio again. I hope not.
Sorry, I was muted. I think we lost him, but we'll be working to bring him back to connection.
Okay.
If you want to make any comment in the meantime?
Yeah, well, I certainly in agreement. I think some of the question of that
the larger investment frameworks.
Or not?
Yeah. So I think it's getting on and off. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So yeah, I was making the point about the financing. So we need to get those evidences that I've just mentioned into the design of large-scale finance for climate related policies, and I think the Green Climate Fund, which is the one of the outcomes of the Paris Agreement, should give huge attention to this. And this is actually an area where we're doing some work together with a very interesting program in UK. And I also encourage you to have a look at it. It's ESPA, ESPA, and I asked Mariana also to send a link. ESPA has a homepage, and this is a fairly large program developed by the British government, and I had the privilege of being a member of the International Advisory Board, and it's just about to finish ESPA. And ESPA has financed something like 45 million pounds on research to document the importance of ecosystem services for poverty alleviation. So there's some very interesting data there, and I think those pieces of evidence, as I mentioned before, should be better used to influence financing strategies and public policies that are associated with ecosystem-based adaptation. So I think the more that we can provide evidence that ecosystem services are good for poverty alleviation, so that these have social interests, the more that we can show that restoring ecosystems generate jobs, and jobs are relevant for policy making, I think the more, the greater the chances for us succeeding in getting the message across. Okay, we are in our last 10 minutes or so for the course. So let me hand over to Peter to say some comments, and I close. I will then close with my final remarks. But before that, let me thank Mariana Pavan, who has been great all along. Thank you so much, Mariana. Um, I also, before Peter makes his comments, like to ask Mariana what are the next steps. If there is any announcement you would like to make or any comment you would like to make, please share with us.
Sure, Virgilio. Thanks a lot. It has been a huge pleasure to be the course coordinator for this. And I don't want to close the session without mentioning to you and to Peter that we have received a lot of positive feedbacks, many people thanking for the content and complimenting on how good were all the lessons and all the content. There has been a lot of interaction between the students. So I'm very glad to be part of this. The course goes offline on January 29, which is Monday, and all the students who reach the minimum grade will receive their certificates. And I think there is some discussion about the rerun of this course, but we don't have that answer yet. But any news regarding that will be posted to the students. And thank you, Peter, also for such great lessons. I also did the course myself, and it was a lot of interesting information. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Mariana. Thank you so much once again. Peter.
Yes. Well, I just wanted to express, and again, my appreciation for the opportunity to be part of this this excellent project, which we've been discussing terrestrial ecosystems and the needs for a better understanding of the economics and policy of natural resource management. And I think that the result has been very synthetic and very exciting for me. I've took part in and participated in some of the other classes, and I think that Virgilio's and Tom's and the other speakers, Edna and so on, have really been very useful for understanding all of the complexity of dealing with the instruments and the knowledge base associated with terrestrial ecosystem management. But we all take this away with as a starting point, and they're not going to stop here. And I think the emphasis of this session has been on the need for activism and the need for well-informed, but also politically directed action on the part of our groups in society to build coalitions and to build networks that can be more effective in addressing these concerns and bringing them to policymakers' eyes. So I think that is the take home, and I thank Virgilio for putting this together, and I appreciate very much having been invited to be a part of it. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Peter. Great. It's been a great pleasure to have you, not only as a professor of the course, but also very much engaged in various sessions and so on. So thank you, Peter, so much. I think for us has been a great opportunity. I had never had a course of this format before, so for me it was as a learning experience. And I'd like to ask a question to Mariana. Will these available, and how will they be available?
Virgilio, as far as I know, all the materials go offline, so all the tests and everything else goes offline. What we are recommending to the students is to download all the readings and save all the links. Also, the videos can be downloaded as well. So they won't have the structure of the platform ready, but they can download the videos and all the complementary materials and access them again anytime they want.
Okay, and they will be online for how long now?
The platform, they all go offline on Monday. So I suggest doing this maybe before Sunday afternoon.
Okay, so maybe one thing that we could do is as a temporary strategy is to do two things. First, to download all the videos into the Amazonia.edu platform, so that we have all those videos there available while we plan maybe something with the SDG Academy. But in the meantime, and actually, Mariana, I will ask you to post a message about Amazonia.edu, send a PDF about Amazonia.edu, and this is a platform that FAS and SDSN were putting together to provide educational material on various issues. So we want to have this course replicated there as well. And also, I would like to ask you, students, and maybe you could also send a message, Mariana, to students on this, asking those who enjoyed the course to share the link that you, Mariana, will send to them, so that the students can use the videos even without a structure of the course, because they can simply recommend whatever number video, lecture number 10, 15, or whatever the number that they would like in particular, and share those through WhatsApp or Facebook or something. Just share those, because this is the whole idea was to have access to information, and we invested a lot of our time and funds in putting this course together with these videos. So please do make use of those, do share those with your colleagues, your friends, and let's make this course alive. And look out for other videos. I have just come back from Peru, as I mentioned to you, and we will be producing 2 or 3 short video lectures on what happened in Peru. And this, Mariana, is going to be dealt by Macarena. Macarena is editing those video lectures. They're not going to have the same structure and of what we had this time around because of resource availability, but they will be very interesting classes as well. So look for Amazonia.edu, and we'll have more educational material in the along the year and in the coming years as well. And finally, if you want to know more about the Amazon, also look out for field courses. We're going to have field courses in the Amazon, and Mariana can also send more information about the upcoming courses that we're going to have. These are courses that will last 3 weeks, 2 weeks, and these are going to be very intensive learning opportunities. So thank you so much, and keep on making your hopes alive. I learned something very interesting. The reality of the world doesn't allow us to be optimistic. However, it allows us to be hopeful. So I'm hopeful that the world will change, that the revolution that we see happening in China with green policies will also happen in other parts of the world. I think changes like we saw in France, with the government of France being so outspoken about climate, and what is happening in places like Canada and so on. I think there are many very interesting cases of green policies throughout the world, and they will have a big impact, or they can have a big impact on terrestrial ecosystems. So be a part of this change, get to action, and study, be informed as much as you can, participate with evidence, with scientific evidence, look out for more evidence, and help qualify the debate. I think the debate is open. There's a lot of room for innovation, a lot of room to change policies. So be a part of this change. And let's keep our hopes alive that the planet will overcome the challenge that we have facing us. Okay? Ciao and all the best.